Collars come in many different shapes and sizes. This can be dictated by fashion trend or the function of the garment. However, no matter how diverse the selection of collars may seem, they fit very neatly within 4 different categories. These are flat collars, stand collars, those that are an integral part of the garment, meaning they're not separate, and the collar and revere. All of these different collar types, however, have one thing in common. That is, they all start from the toile. We need to make sure that as a designer, we are happy with the fit of the toile before we can proceed with the collar, because it is from the pattern of this toile that we will create the pattern for our collar. This video will focus on flat collar types, with a specific focus on that of a Peter Pan collar. We will talk through basic pattern drafting and construction processes. In this video, we're going to talk through the basic principles of drafting a flat collar with a specific focus on a Peter Pan collar, which we have here in this example. We've already established at this point that we are happy with the body of the toile we would be working on, as the pattern from that toile is what we use as a base to produce any collar pattern. The book I'm using for reference is the Winifred Aldridge Metric Pattern Cutting for Women's Wear. It doesn't matter which edition, even though this is the 5th edition, as the basic principles we'll be applying are exactly the same. You can see here on the chapter on collars, we have some basic terminology and things that you can make yourself more familiar with, along with the breakdown of the collar types that we discussed earlier in the video. So the first one we'll be looking at will be the flat collar, as we've said, which is number 1 here as our Peter Pan collar. So what we need to start off with is the patterns for our toile. So I have them here. So we need to trace around these pattern pieces onto a separate piece of paper. Now we need to make sure we weight the patterns so they're not going to move and trace around. When the area we're interested in is the neck shape. So I'm going to do a little bit of the armhole and shoulder. I'm going to trace around our neck edge. And down the front. Now we need to mark in these lines here. This one is our center front. This is our fold line, and this is our facing. So this folds back on the shirt. So the fold line and the center front are critical points when we consider drafting a collar. As you can see on this sample, the collar comes into the center front. So we need to know where that point is for reference. Then what I'm going to do, because we're dealing with a pattern, it had a seam allowance on it, I'm just going to take off the seam allowance, or mark in the seam allowance on my pattern. Around our neck and shoulder edge. Now this is the yoke pattern of my shirt, and you can see this is the neck edge and this is the center back seam. So I need to place, I'm going to put seam point to seam point because I'm going to pretend that the shoulders are stitched together, which is why I wanted to mark our seam allowance points so I can put them together. But when we draft a Peter Pan collar, we overlap at the armhole edge 2 centimeters. So I'm going to mark 2 centimeters at my armhole edge, and I'm just going to make that a little bit more pronounced so I know where this seam point I want to hit that 2 centimeter point edge. So I'm going to place those together and overlap 2 centimeters. This 2 centimeter overlap here creates a dart-like suppression that compensates for the slope of our shoulder. If we didn't take this out, this edge of the collar would be fluted and flounce over rather than lay flat when it's worn. So I'm now going to trace around the back neck of our shirt and a little bit down the shoulder, just so we can see where the edge of our shoulder is. But we can also see here that this pattern has a centre back seam. So I'm going to remove that because it all depends on the shape of your collar. This shirt has an opening at the front, so therefore we want our collar to be in one piece across the back. So review your patterns and your final style and shape choices as you progress, because depending on where your opening is would depend whether you left that seam on or not. So I am just going to remove that seam allowance, mark that in, so I know that line is my centre back. The centre back line will also become the grain line. Of your collar. So we know our centre front is here. The shape and the depth of the collar is really up to you as a designer. So if we look at the sample I have here, this has a finished depth of 6 centimeters. But you can see that that is quite narrow, but it really is up to you to decide. We know we already have a seam allowance around here because that is on my pattern. So plus that centimetre there, we would need to come down 7 centimetres. As a preference, I like to square across there at the base, just to make sure we don't end up with the collar having a point or it dips up slightly at the centre back. So if we square across there at 90 degrees, we know we have a nice shape there at the bottom of our collar. Then it's about drawing in freehand the shape you want for your collar. Usually this depth is quite parallel and it ends up with a curve. We don't want to go past the centre front, so if I wanted to, I could even come in a couple of mil and just draw in my curved edge. So once you have the shape of your collar, you then need to trace that off. So you can put some paper over the top and just trace through. What you will need to do though is make sure this line here then, we want to open it out as a full pattern piece. So you can see if that shape was to be traced off. I've then added a centimetre seam allowance to this outer edge. I've put some notches in to help with construction of the curved shape, and I've also cut it out on the fold so it is a complete pattern piece. And I've written on here that it is a flat collar, that this is my under collar piece. I'm going to cut one, and what we have to consider then also is interfacings for our collar. this is our top collar piece. And here you can see that I've put on here that this one's going to be block fused to help give body and shape to the collar once it is constructed. I'll explain that in our next step when we get to the production of the collar. I have two pattern pieces, as in an under collar and a top collar, because they're also slightly different in size. Once I've traced off my pattern shape and created my under collar pattern piece, I've then traced around this again, but then added a little bit extra, just a couple of mil, to the top collar piece. So you can see the top collar from nothing at the point, then gradually increasing to 2 mil around the collar shape, coming back into nothing at the point. This helps to ensure that the seam of the collar curls to the underside and is not seen on the front like this example. Yeah, we can see that the one side the seam is hidden and the other side it's not. So this is the way it's been pressed, and also the allowance on the top collar has not been added. So we want to avoid seeing the seam from the front when the collar is worn. So let's cover some basics with regards to construction. So you can see on here I have a piece of fabric, just a rectangle shape, a block shape that is large enough for the shape of the collar to be drawn on. It has an interfacing already applied to make this more stable, so the integrity of the shape of my collar is maintained. So I've drawn my collar shape on here, then I would cut it out. Rather than cutting it out in fabric and interfacing separately and fusing them together, because you could find that there could be some discrepancies in shape doing it that way. So I would recommend that anything that has a curve to it, that block fusing is the way to go to help make sure you keep the shape you're hoping for. When we then come to construct, we have our top collar, which is interfaced, and then an under collar, which is not. So usually the area of the collar that you're going to see when the garment is worn, you want it to look crisp and sharp. So that is the area that we interface. You can see here that the edges are a couple of mil apart. This is because the top collar was cut larger, but when we sew, we have to keep our raw edges together. So what it does then is push the balance of that 2 mil in towards the neck edge. But again, when we sew this onto the garment, we will keep them together, which will force this seam to roll to the back. So with my notches, I was able to make sure I matched the collar as we went around the curve, maintaining our seam allowance parallel around the shape of the collar. On a convex curve, we have to cut out little triangular shapes to reduce the volume of the seam allowance when we turn the collar through to the right side. An alternative, depending on your fabric type, of course, as this is a thin cotton, I've just used a pinking shears here to do the work for me. So once you've trimmed your collar seam allowance all the way around, because we have a curve all the way around, you can then turn your collar through and press. So you can see when I've pressed, I've brought these raw edges together around the neck edge. So it's ready to be applied now to our garment. But if I turn it to the underside, you can see the contrast of the top collar has rolled underneath, hiding our seam all the way around. And that's the sort of thing you'd be looking for the finish of your collar. So that's just the basic principles of drafting and constructing a Peter Pan collar.